Hello and welcome everybody to chapter 29 of book 2 of the Royal Ranger series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. Life at the castle went back to its uneventful routine after the departure of the noisy, irreverent Scandians. Maddie found herself wishing that they had stayed longer. They had brought a breath of fresh air to the castle. However, she had work to do, and the following evening she set out to keep watch at the old abbey. She waited till the castle had settled down for the evening, then crept surreptitiously down to the cellars. As before, she took a full lantern with her. She also took her sling and her sacks, and she wore her ranger cloak over her normal day wear of jerkin, leggings, and boots. She let herself into the concealed chamber at the end of the cellar, pausing to light her lantern from one of the lamps that was kept burning there. She eased the concealed door shut behind her, confident now that she would be able to open it on her return the following morning. Then, holding the lantern high, she set out down the sloping, uneven path that led under the moat. Knowing what to expect this time, she was unfazed by the dripping water that ran down the tunnel walls as she passed beneath the moat. As before, she felt the tunnel angling upward as she passed beneath the moat and out onto dry ground once more. There were still bundles of roots hanging through the ceiling of the tunnel, and she used her sacks to clear them away. She'd almost certainly be passing through here again on subsequent nights, and she didn't enjoy the sensation of having them suddenly loom out of the darkness and clutch at her face and hair. This time, with only dim starlight outside, she didn't see the circle of light shining as she approached the end of the tunnel. It came as something of a shock to reach the tangle of bushes at the exit. Realizing that her lantern would shine like a beacon in the dark, she quickly extinguished it before exiting the tunnel. She pushed the bushes back into place across the entrance, concealing it from outside view, then set off down the hill to the spot where she'd left Bumper. Conscious that there were lookouts posted on all the castle walls, she moved carefully in a half-crouch, making use of all available cover. She also kept her camouflage cloak wrapped around herself and her cowl up. In the dim light, the moon was yet to rise. It was highly unlikely that anyone would notice the indistinct figure moving slowly and silently through the knee-high grass of the park. Still, she breathed a sigh of relief when she reached the tree line and disappeared into the concealing shadows there. She stood upright and made her way to the hidden glade where Bumper was waiting for her. His ears pricked. He had obviously heard her coming, but, as he had been trained to do, remained silent until she spoke first. "Pleased to see me?" she asked, rubbing his silky nose and handing him the carrot he knew she would be carrying. He nickered softly, then crunched the carrot contentedly. She glanced around the small clearing. Everything here seemed to be in order. His feed bag hung from a branch, and when she checked it, she saw it was still half full. The water bucket was nearly empty. She'd fill it when they returned. He could always make his own way to the small stream nearby, of course, but she preferred to leave water handy for him. Quickly, she saddled him and swung up into the saddle. Her bow was in its bow case, strapped to the saddle. She took it out to check that it was undamaged and the string was still firm, with no sign of dampness or unraveling. Satisfied that all was well, she slid it back into the bow case. Then, touching her heels lightly to Bumper's sides, she set out down the twisting game trail for the abbey. She dismounted when they were 20 meters from the clearing where the abbey stood, and left Bumper behind as she crept silently forward through the trees. There was no sign of anyone in the clearing, and she turned her head this way and that, listening carefully for any sound, any hint that there were people inside the abbey. Nothing. She walked back to Bumper and held her finger to her lips, then pointed to the ground at his feet. The message was clear. Be silent and stay here. He tossed his head in acknowledgement, and she turned to creep back to the abbey. There was open ground for 15 meters between the edge of the forest and the building. She felt an almost overwhelming temptation to cross it slowly and furtively, but that wouldn't serve any purpose. Slow movement wouldn't conceal her from any potential observer. Taking care to make no noise, she stepped lightly across the clear ground until she was beside the door. She noted that it was now closed, yet she remembered leaving it slightly open last time she had been here. Could have been the wind, she thought, but she doubted it. It was more likely that someone had closed the door behind them, and that meant that Warwick's informant had been right. There had been people here recently. Question was, were any of them still here? Only one way to find out, she thought. Leaning forward, she pushed against the door with her left hand, her right hand touching the hilt of her sax. The door gave easily. Someone had obviously oiled it, and that indicated that they planned to use the abbey again in the future. She let it swing open, hanging back, and waiting to see if there was any reaction from inside. Again, nothing. Drawing her sax, she stepped quickly through the door, opening and moved to one side out of the doorway. There was no sound from the abbey, no challenging voice, no urgent scuffling of feet as someone moved to take cover. She waited until her eyes were accustomed to the gloom and peered around, searching the interior and sections. There was no sign of anyone. Aware that she had been holding her breath, she let it out in a long sigh and resheathed her sax. The old farmer who had reported seeing people here had said he had seen them around midnight, and Warwick's previous observations agreed with that timing. That meant she had at least an hour to wait to see if anyone turned up. She moved down the body of the church and climbed the rickety stairs to the choir gallery. From there, she'd have a good view of the entire building and still be able to remain concealed. She settled down on the floor beside the front bench in the gallery, behind the solid timber balustrade, made herself as comfortable as possible, and settled in to wait. The moon had risen now, and was shining at an oblique angle through the window set beside the gallery. She woke with a start, realizing that she must have dozed off. She looked at the window. There was no sign of the moon, yet she knew it had risen. She had been awake when that had happened, watching the pale silver light flood through the window across the interior of the old church. Cautiously, she raised her head, making sure the abbey was still deserted. "Fine ranger you are," she said, thinking of the scathing rebuke she would have received from Will for falling asleep on watch. On the wall, opposite the gallery window, was a high slit in the stonework, no more than an arrow slit, really. She looked at that now, and could see the moon's light sending a narrow, high-angled shaft across the building. The moon had risen, passed across the church, and was now descending on the far side. She estimated that she had been asleep for at least 2 hours. At least she had been confident that there had been no sign of the Red Fox clan while she had been asleep. "I'm not so dopey that I could sleep through the noise made by a whole bunch of people gathering there below me," she said. But it was scant comfort. The unavoidable fact was, she had fallen asleep while she was supposed to be on watch. She rose now, stretching her cramped limbs. She had slept with her head in an angle, without any proper support, and her neck ached. She rolled her head and shoulders, trying to ease the stiffness, but without much success. She climbed down the ladder stairs to the floor of the abbey and headed for the door. She made one last inspection to make sure that the building had remained unoccupied, and there was no sign that anyone else had been in here in the past few hours. Nothing seemed to have changed, and the rough sketch of the fox mask was still in place. She checked around the doorway, but there was no sign of the dust and dirt there having been disturbed, no sign of footprints anywhere. "Just as well for you," she muttered. Even though she was sure there was nobody else around, she checked carefully before she left the abbey, then moved quickly across the open ground to the shelter of the trees, where Bumper waited patiently for her. "Fell asleep, did you?" he asked, and she wondered how he knew. "Just resting my eyes," she said, "just for a few minutes." Ha! She knew she could never fool her horse, so she said nothing, resigned to letting him have the moral victory, yet again. She swung up into the saddle and turned his head for home. There was no point in waiting here any longer. All reported sightings of activity at the Abbey had taken place before midnight, and she judged it was well after that now. "We'll just have to come back again tomorrow, and the night after that, if necessary," she told Bumper. "So long as you get a good night's sleep," he replied. She chose to ignore him. All right, that's going to be the end of Chapter 29. Thank you for listening. I'll see you guys next time in Chapter 30. God bless, and have a good one.